40 years ago yesterday, all of our lives were changed, some of them dramatically, by something few of us expected to happen on October 16th, 1978, the election of Karol Wojtyła as Pope John Paul II. 11 years after that, something else unexpected happened. The Cold War ended nonviolently. 29 years after that, we're living in another unexpected moment. The entire Western world is taking stock of its situation in a moment of unexpected confusion, a moment when the democratic project is threatened, both by external enemies and by internal confusions and quarrels. Among those quarrels and confusions is that of today's topic, church and state. John Paul II had many important things to say about the problem of church and state, which is an ancient one in the history of the world. And I want to come specifically to his view of the church and the state in a moment. But in order to set a context for that, so we can get a bit more deeply into this subject that is often done in the heat of political debate, I'd like to make a few observations from what I call in the paper you've been given a John Paul II political lexicon, a kind of dictionary of key terms that John Paul II explained to us in an important way, asking what can we learn from him still today that might set a path beyond the kind of contention and polarization and frankly irrationality that Father Maciej just described. The first of these terms is the very term, the free society. By the free society, John Paul II meant a 21st century society in which there were three interlocking parts: a democratic political community, a free or market-centered economy, and a vibrant public moral culture. Today, there are no really great debates about the first two parts, although there are many problems. There are important arguments to be engaged in all of our countries about guaranteeing the independence of the judiciary, safeguarding elections, maintaining a robust civil society, assuring the protection of basic civil rights, figuring out the boundaries of state regulation of the economy. But in John Paul II's mind, it was the third part of the puzzle, the public moral culture, that was the key to all the rest. Political and economic freedom lets loose tremendous human energies that are typically frustrated under authoritarian or tyrannical rule. What's going to direct those energies so that they lead to human flourishing and to social solidarity? It was the public moral culture, John Paul II argued, that had to take the lead role in shaping the kind of people who would make free politics and free economics work. John Paul II understood that politics is always downstream from culture. If our politics are divisive and rancorous, it is almost certainly because something is wrong with our public moral culture. That is absolutely true of my own country, the United States, and it's true elsewhere. moral and cultural renewal, a recommitment to living in the truth, which helped liberate this part of Europe from communism, is thus an essential part of democratic renewal today. The second key idea in this John Paul II political lexicon is the idea of freedom. What is the freedom of the free society? Do we 21st century citizens of democracies really know in depth what freedom means? I'm afraid that throughout the democratic world today, the very idea of freedom is being infantilized. It's as if that great moral philosopher Frank Sinatra summed up the meaning of freedom in the phrase, "I did it my way." But if that's the only meaning of freedom, then we're in deep trouble. That is not the idea of freedom that liberated Central and Eastern Europe from tyranny. The revolution of conscience that took place in this part of the world in the 1980s and made possible the revolution of 1989 was based on a much richer, thicker, nobler concept of freedom, freedom tethered to truth, freedom tied to truth, and freedom ordered to goodness. And the democratic world needs a rebirth of that idea of freedom today. We need to get beyond Frank Sinatra. The third idea in this John Paul II political lexicon that's important for today, I think, is the idea of Europe, or more broadly, the West. What is Europe? What is the West? Is the West simply a set of political and economic arrangements, or is it a cultural artifact? Is it a civilization? John Paul II made very clear in Ecclesia in Europa and in his general audience commentaries on the European Constitutional Treaty of 2004 that Europe had to understand itself, indeed the entire West had to understand itself as a civilizational project with very deep roots. And there are three of those with which we must reckon today: Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. From Jerusalem, from biblical religion, the West learned that life is adventure, pilgrimage, journey. History is not circular or random. History is going somewhere. So the exodus of Israel from Egypt is not just a spiritual metaphor in the lives of Jews and Christians. It's a foundational experience for the Western idea of history. From Athens, from classical Greek philosophy, the West learned to have faith in reason and in reason's capacity to get at the truth, including the moral truth. This faith in reason, connected to the biblical idea of creation, is why science developed in the Western world as it did nowhere else. This conviction that there are truths built into the world and into us shaped the founding of history's first modern democratic republic, my own country, the United States, where the Declaration of Independence stakes the nation's claim to independent nationhood on self-evident truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and from those truths are derived rights endowed in everyone by nature and nature's God. And from Rome, the West learned that the rule of law is superior to the rule of brute force, or raw coercion in human affairs. Turn your mind back to when you were trying to translate Cicero in third year Latin, and you remember the great arguments in Rome over the superiority of the rule of law. To ignore any one of these, to ignore Jerusalem, to ignore Athens, to ignore Rome, is to misread the story of the West. John Paul II insisted. They're all necessary parts of what makes Europe Europe, what makes the Western world the Western world. If we lose faith in the God of the Bible, we have seen in intellectual life in the West over the past 200 years, we begin to lose our grip, we begin to lose our faith in reason. When we lose our faith in reason, the democratic project is in deep trouble because reason-based argument is the lifeblood of democracy. If we don't believe in reason, if there's only your truth and my truth, how do we have a democratic debate? So democratic renewal in this 21st century will give serious attention to all three of these sources of Western civilization, and we will rid ourselves of the quite childish historical notion that the roots of 21st century democracy go back no farther than the Enlightenment in the 17th century. That's a false story. It needs to be contested, and we need to move beyond it. Another idea crucial to John Paul II's political lexicon that sheds light on our situation today is the idea of pluralism. There's an enormous amount of confusion over this word. Pluralism does not simply denote the fact that in every democratic society there are a variety of religious and political opinions. That's plurality. That's just the sheer fact of difference. Pluralism, properly understood, is a cultural achievement. Pluralism is an orderly argument, an orderly conversation among those different points of view by people of goodwill who recognize that we are each trying to seek the common good. The achievement of this genuine pluralism is a society's reply to the word of the Lord conveyed to humanity through the prophet Isaiah, "Come now, let us reason together." In his last published book, Memory and Identity, John Paul II observed that, quote, "fundamental to the Polish spirit is multiplicity and pluralism, not limitation and closure." That national characteristic he described as the Jagiellonian dimension of the Polish spirit, and he traced its roots, of course, to the great Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, what he called a republic embracing many nations, many cultures, many religions. If you can imagine, that vision of a genuinely pluralistic republic strikes a very warm chord in the heart of someone like me, the son of a country that is natively diverse and that always has to work at pluralism and solidarity, and unfortunately isn't doing it too well today. I hope it still has resonance, that idea of the plural republic, in the Poland of the 21st century and indeed throughout the world. You should note that this idea of communities in conversation was not an abstraction for John Paul II. He saw it embodied in the solidarity movement in the 1980s. The ability of that movement to join diverse people in a common, noble enterprise was a great cultural achievement. As he understood it, solidarity, the movement, embodied solidarity, the virtue. And we need to recover that virtue today. Now, with all of that as essential foundation, let me say a word about the specific topic of today, church and state. We begin with the church and then say something about state. In the encyclicals Redemptoris Missio and Centesimus Annus, John Paul II taught a bold vision of the Catholic Church's role in the free society of the 21st century. As he saw it, the church of the 21st century was not an established church, and it was not a partisan church. It was not a church that sought to put state power behind its truth claims, and it was not a church allied to any political party. As the Pope wrote in Redemptoris Missio, the church proposes, she imposes nothing. The church asks, and if necessary, as it was under communism, the church demands to be able to make its evangelical proposal, the gospel proposal, in public, and the church claims the right, as a civil society institution, to be a vigorous partner in the public debate. But the church does not seek, according to John Paul II, legal establishment, nor does it ally itself with any political party. Why? Because that kind of partisanship jeopardizes the church's independence, and even more importantly, from a Catholic point of view, partisanship reduces the gospel to a political program. And that is one of the things that John Paul II criticized, you'll remember, in certain forms of Latin American liberation theology. It reduced the gospel to a political program. By the same token, however, the church of the 21st century, as John Paul II understood it, was not a privatized church, withdrawn from public life by its own decision, by the application of state power, or both. Catholicism in Europe had long been accustomed to ecclesiastical establishment, the church and the state tied together. Those days, John Paul II knew, were over. And the alternative to ecclesiastical establishment was not a privatized church or a ghettoized church or a partisan church, but a genuinely public church. What John Paul II called in Redemptoris Missio a proposing church. This proposing church, he wrote in Centesimus Annus, would work in public primarily through the free associations of civil society rather than as a political actor. The proposing public Catholicism of the 21st century would make arguments. It would not seek to craft policies, although the arguments it made would make it clear that some policies were more congruent than others with freedom lived nobly in solidarity and for the common good. The public church that John Paul II envisioned would work at a deeper level of public life, the level of cultural self-awareness and self-understanding. The church, in other words, would be the guardian of the truths that make it possible to live freedom well. Now, this idea of the public church tells us something about the free society in the 21st century and the role of the state. The free society must indeed be open, and that openness must be comprehensive. The free and open society cannot mean a public space from which religious conviction is excluded as a source of moral and political insight. It is time for Europe, and indeed the entire West, to rid itself of the cultural hangover caused by the idea that democracy, freedom, and openness require a laïcité that creates a religiously naked public square. That is itself an undemocratic idea because it denies to many citizens, the believers, the right to bring the deepest sources of their moral convictions into public life. There's another issue here. The inability of what we now call liquid postmodernity. The inability of liquid postmodernity to give a strong account and defense of democracy against the claims of the new authoritarians in Moscow, Istanbul, Beijing, and elsewhere, and against the political project of radical jihadist Islam, suggests that the West must rediscover today what biblical religion once taught it about the dignity of the human person, the limits of state power, and the moral superiority of living in solidarity with others rather than simply living for oneself at home, alone. The post-Christian West is increasingly a post-rational West. And the inability of a post-rational West to mount a strong, culturally transmitted, politically resonant defense of democracy and the free society on anything other than utilitarian grounds has to be addressed in the years ahead. We need a stronger foundation. And the public church envisioned by John Paul II, neither established nor partisan nor ghettoized, could play an important role here. It's always struck me as a curiosity that a man like John Paul II, who never lived in a mature democracy, should have such a penetrating insight into the democratic project and what, in a political culture, makes democracy possible. But on this 40th anniversary of his election, we should see that less as a curiosity than as a providential intervention in history. We should be grateful for his insight, and we should learn from it much better than we have for the past 30 years. Thank you.